Hello and welcome to week 9. So as we are in officially the second half of the semester, you will find that things are going to continue as normal and as usual with a different theorist each week with your weekly journal. There will be just a few more discussion boards kind of scattered here and there. And one final assignment that I am going to go ahead and introduce you to this week. But as we look at the theorist for this week, we come to a man that you may have heard his name, and if you have, you certainly will remember it because it's unusual, and that's Brofenbrenner. And so while he does have a little bit of connection to some of the theorists that we have studied so far, you will also find that it kind of stands alone. One, just because of the technical name, which is the human ecological theory, but also just because he's kind of looking at things from a different perspective. So if you've learned anything about Brofenbrenner's theory before, one of the things that you probably remember is a bunch of circles. And so he actually, in a video that I posted for you this week, as he was describing his own theory, he talked about the Russian nesting dolls. And those are the ones where it has two pieces and it's one doll, but then when you take it apart, you find a nested piece inside that's smaller. And then within that piece is another doll that is smaller. And so the intention of his analogy is to describe what his theory is saying, which is that we have all of these little layers that are building up to something larger, but at the center is the child, the individual. So when you look at this week's folder, you'll see a couple of things that I put in here to be able to help you with his theory. Now, one of the things about his theory is that it's pretty black and white. There's not as much interpretation with this one as some of the other theories that we have mentioned, because he basically lays out these different layers, these concentric circles. And basically the way to remember it is that the smaller this circle, the more directly it is touching the child. So the microsystem, which is the smallest, that's where you have the family and the school, people who are interacting with the child on a daily basis. And as you start to move into these outer layers, the impact on development doesn't change. It's whether or not the child is directly contained within that particular circle. So when we look at things out here in the macro system, we see things like laws. Well, children aren't showing up at Congress to be able to have an impact on their education and their development. However, I think we would all agree that when laws are passed, especially having to do with children, with education, it's going to impact the person in the middle. So again, we're not diminishing the impact on development. What we're saying is that the child may not actually be right in the heart of interacting with these influences. So this was just a graphic that I found. I am definitely a visual learner, so I feel like this is the best way to be able to help to remember what his theory is saying. So here is again a primary source written by Brofenbrenner, and here is the PowerPoint for this week. And then these videos that I have here are just kind of help to supplement. So this is just an introduction to his model. This is the video that I was referencing before. As you can see, it's very short, but this is him actually discussing his theory, and I think that nothing is better than getting it literally from the horse's mouth, and so that is what I put this video in here for. But this video you can see is much longer, and I'm not expecting that you're going to sit down in one sitting to watch this week, but when you do have the time, I think this is a really interesting lecture that he gave. One of the things that he discusses a lot in his theory is about the family. And so sometimes I think it's great to get outside of what the black and white says about a particular theory or a theorist and look at how they actually are also viewing other things that are happening in our lives. And so that's what this video is for. So you have your journal to do for this week, and hopefully what you're going to see when we get down here to this philosophy paper is how everything that you've done so far is leading up to this assignment. So when you click on this folder, you're going to find 3 different resources. This is the instructions for the philosophy paper. This is a link to a website that I used tremendously in graduate school, both for my master's and my doctorate. And so I've given you the link to it. If you have not become familiar with the OWL at Purdue, then I would recommend that you go ahead and bookmark this. And then an APA sample paper. So the first thing I want to show you is the link that I gave you for the OWL at Purdue. So hopefully you have learned that in social sciences, you're required to use APA formatting. And so I gave you the link to kind of the landing page for APA at the OWL at Purdue. So they have an overview and a workshop, and then there's a formatting and a style guide. So if you have a question about how your paper should be formatted, you can find the answer here. If you have a question about how a certain source should be cited, you can find the answer here. I'm not sure that there was ever anything that I had a question about that I couldn't find the answer here. So this is a fantastic website to bookmark. Now, the other thing that I put in here is a sample paper. And I do want to take just a minute to kind of highlight a few things about an APA style paper, because I am going to grade you pretty hard on APA for this paper. The reason is because this is kind of your final culmination of everything that you've learned about in this class. And it's also meant to be a document that you are going to want to take when you go for interviews, when you're up for promotions, to be able to say, this is what I believe and I can defend it. And so I want the paper to be well written, but I also want it to be formatted correctly. So when you click on here, it's actually going to take you to a PDF, and you can actually save this, and I would recommend you doing that as well. But a few things that I just want to highlight before I give you the instructions for the philosophy paper. So the first thing is looking at the running head. So you notice on the first page, you actually have the words running head. Only the R is capitalized. And then after the colon, you have your title. Now, if you notice, the title is actually much longer, but you can shorten it so that that's what's going to be at the top of all of the rest of the pages. You're going to have page numbers starting on page 1. And then you have your title, you have your name, and then you have your university. That is all that needs to go on your cover page. So no fancy graphics, no fancy font, no color. This is meant to be a very formal style paper. Now you'll notice on here that they have an author's note. I am not requiring you to put an author's note on here. Most of the time this is going to be used for publication purposes. So then when you get to the second page, you're going to notice that the words running head dropped off, but your title stays. This is going to be your running head on pages 2 and forward. So make sure that in Microsoft Word, when you go to the headings setting up at the top, that you check the box that says a different first page. Because if not, you're either going to have the words running head on every single page, or you're not going to have running head at all. So just make sure that that's how you get rid of the words running head starting on page 2. Page 2 is always your abstract, and I do expect you to write an abstract for this paper. An abstract is between 150 and 250 words, so it's kind of your introduction, so the reader knows what it is that they're going to be reading throughout your paper. So this is a really great way to be able to summarize everything in one place. One suggestion that I was given is not to write your abstract until you've written your paper. And the reason is that way you already know exactly what you put in your paper, and you don't want to inadvertently say that you're going to discuss something that you don't then discuss in your paper. But I would like to see an abstract in your paper. And then starting on page 3, this is where you're actually going to start your paper. So you notice that we have the title. It is not bolded. It is not underlined, it is just simply centered. And then we start with our kind of introductory paragraph. You notice that we are now having headings. I am a huge fan of headings. I think that they help everyone. The reason that we use headings is to organize your paper, because if you just have one long narrative for 10 pages, it's going to be really difficult to keep track of what you're talking about. However, when I break it up into sections, I know that as I'm reading it, I'm only going to be looking at this particular section. And then when I go to the next section, I'm really focusing on that particular topic. So I would highly encourage you to use headings in your paper. And the formatting guide on the OWL will show you the different levels of headings. But if you're just doing a level 1 heading, it's just bolded and centered. If you get to a level 2 heading, you're going to notice that it's still bolded, but it's left justified. You get down to a level 3, it's bolded, but indented with a period. So just kind of keep that in mind as you are writing your paper, that using headings is a great way to organize your paper, but just make sure that you're doing them correctly. And the only other thing I want to mention is citations, because I know a lot of times there's been some confusion about how to cite authors. And so one of the best things you're going to want to remember is anytime you mention the authors, you're going to need to put the year. So it doesn't matter if it's within the same paragraph or not. Every single time you mention the authors, you need to put the year in parentheses. So if you see something like et al., then that means there were 3 or more authors, but the very first time that you mention the particular authors, you have to list all of their names. You can't put et al. Until the second time that you mention them. The only time you need to put a page number is if you're using a direct quote. And so just make sure that you have them in quotation marks. And so that way I know that you're actually citing what someone else has said. So those were just a few things I wanted to point out just for style purposes, because I do want you to get all of your APA points. I don't want you to lose any points simply because of formatting. But again, if you have a question, look at the OWL at Purdue or send me an email and I'll be happy to answer. So the last thing is just going over the actual philosophy paper, and this is where you're just going to pull it all together. So you're going to see that typically speaking, it's between 8 and 10 pages. That does not include your title page or your reference page. But I understand that everyone writes differently. So if your paper is only 7 pages, but you fully answered everything, then that's totally fine. What I don't want to see is a 2-page paper or a 20-page paper. So as long as you feel like you addressed everything that you wanted and needed to address, then you can consider your paper complete. So the first thing that you're looking at, what I want your kind of introduction to be, goes back to that first paper that you wrote. Why is it important to have educational theories? Why is it important for teachers to have a personal philosophy of teaching and learning? So this is where you're kind of setting up the reason why you're going to discuss your personal philosophy. So you can absolutely pull from what you wrote in your first paper, and I would expect that you're probably going to add to it as well. So then you get to the body where you're going to discuss your personal philosophy and incorporate the theories. This is where the journals are going to be so helpful to you because you're going to be able to pull what you believed and what you agreed with into this section. So I'm kind of giving you a wide net in this particular section to discuss whatever you think you need to discuss that relates to teaching and learning. So instructional strategies, teaching styles, learning styles, physical environment, anything at all that has to do with what you believe would make teachers effective as well as students to be able to learn can be in this section. And then finally, make sure you have a good conclusion. This is where you want to wrap it all up in a pretty bow. You want to summarize what you said. You want to make application for the future. So I really am looking at that conclusion piece also. I don't just want a sentence that says, and here's my philosophy of education. Wrap it all up in a pretty little bow. So this is going to be your final exam. So just make sure that you have this done by the end of the semester. So hopefully you can see the purpose behind why I had the course set up the way that I did, and you kind of find that this is going to be a great way to pull it all together. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and I will see you next week.